Brian Boyle grew up in a small Maryland town, the kind of place where summer afternoons were filled with the thwack of baseballs against gloves, the hum of lawnmowers, and the distant barking of dogs that seemed to chase every bicycle on the street. He was a tall, broad-shouldered kid with an easy grin, the sort who made friends quickly and wore his optimism like a second skin. Athletics had always been part of his rhythm. He was the kind of teenager who was just as comfortable running sprints on the track as he was diving into the pool. His parents, always supportive, watched proudly as their son moved through life with the momentum of someone destined for big things. High school was where his talent began to sharpen into something undeniable. Coaches whispered that he had the kind of build and drive that could take him far. Swimming came naturally, running even more so, and he thrived in the balance between schoolwork, training, and the electric buzz of adolescent dreams. He imagined college ahead, maybe even a shot at competing at the highest levels. He was only a teenager, but already the horizon seemed limitless. That summer evening in 2004, the sun had just dipped low enough to paint the sky in streaks of orange and purple. Brian, then 18, had just finished a swim workout and was driving home along the quiet roads he knew by heart. The hum of the car was steady, the world outside sliding past in a blur of cornfields and fading daylight. In a moment so sudden and violent that it fractured his world forever, a dump truck pulled out in front of him. Metal shrieked, glass exploded, and his car folded under the crushing force of steel and weight. The sound was deafening. Then came silence. First responders would later say they weren't sure how anyone could have survived that collision. When they reached the wreckage, Brian was crumpled inside, his body broken in ways too numerous to count. He was rushed to the hospital, sirens wailing, his parents following behind in stunned disbelief. In the ambulance, paramedics fought to keep his fragile thread of life from snapping. He had lost 60% of his blood. His heart stopped more than once. For long moments, Brian Boyle was dead. At the hospital, doctors worked furiously. Emergency rooms are chaotic even on ordinary days, but when they wheeled him in, the atmosphere shifted into one of grim urgency. The trauma team opened his chest, restarted his heart, transfused bag after bag of blood. Surgeons stabilized him enough to operate, though they whispered to one another that the chances were almost non-existent. His pelvis was shattered. His ribs were broken. His lungs had collapsed. His organs were torn. By the time the night was over, he had endured more than a dozen surgeries, and no one could say for sure if he would wake up. For weeks, Brian lay in a coma. Machines breathed for him. Monitors ticked off numbers in the sterile glow of hospital lights. His parents sat by his bed, holding his hand, whispering to him, praying. His father would recount old stories about little league games and family vacations. His mother, exhausted but unyielding, refused to accept the possibility that her boy might slip away forever. Friends visited, some leaving in tears after seeing the athlete they remembered now reduced to tubes and wires. To the doctors, the case was nearly hopeless. To his family, hope was all they had. And then, slowly, impossibly, Brian began to stir. His eyes fluttered, his fingers twitched, and after weeks that blurred into months, he emerged from the coma. The world he returned to was alien. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. His body, once so powerful, now felt foreign and unresponsive. But his mind, foggy at first, then sharpening like a blade, was alive. He could hear the voices around him, understand the despair in doctors' tones, the encouragement in his parents' words. He was trapped in a body that no longer obeyed, but somewhere inside, Brian Boyle was still there, waiting for a way out. Rehabilitation was brutal. It began with the smallest, most humiliating of steps. Nurses had to teach him how to swallow again, spoonfuls of water spilling down his chin. Every movement was agony. His bones screamed, his muscles shook, and his scars itched with a pain that seemed endless. But every tiny milestone mattered. Sitting upright for the first time was a victory. Taking a sip of juice unassisted was a triumph. When he willed his hand to twitch and finally saw his fingers move, he cried. No one outside that room could understand the magnitude of that moment, how it felt to claw back even the smallest fragment of autonomy. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. Rehabilitation centers became his world, with their white walls, clinking equipment, and the steady encouragement of therapists who sometimes doubted, but never said it aloud. Each day Brian faced the impossible, teaching his body to live again. His pelvis had been pieced together with metal plates, his ribs knitted back in painful scaffolding, his lungs scarred. Doctors had told him survival itself was miraculous, walking again was unthinkable. But Brian didn't want to survive. He wanted to live. He wanted to run, to swim, to race, to feel the rush of air in his lungs and the strain of muscles driving him forward. He wanted his life back. In the quiet of hospital nights, when the hallways echoed with distant footsteps and the hum of machines, Brian would imagine himself on a track. He saw himself diving into water, the chlorine sting in his nose, his arms cutting through waves. He felt the adrenaline of the starting line, the surge of energy as the race began. These weren't idle daydreams. They were fuel. They were promises to himself, unspoken vows that he would not let the crash define him. It would mark him. Yes, it had carved scars across his body and soul, but it would not define who he was or what he could become. The path ahead was endless, but in that first year, Brian Boyle refused to quit. Each agonizing therapy session, each setback, each tear shed in frustration became part of the foundation he was building. He wasn't just learning to move again. He was laying the groundwork for something greater, something that would one day astonish the very doctors who had once whispered his survival was a miracle. For now, though, the miracle was simply this: he was alive, and he was not done yet. The first year after the accident blurred together in a haze of pain and slow progress, but by the time Brian Boyle had relearned the basics of living, breathing without tubes, swallowing, sitting up, he had already decided that mere survival would never be enough. He wanted to walk again, to stand, to reclaim the body that had once been his greatest ally. Every step forward felt like a war waged against his own brokenness. His pelvis, fused with metal plates, groaned with every attempt at movement. His legs trembled like saplings in a storm when therapists coaxed him onto parallel bars. Some days he collapsed, sobbing in frustration. Other days, he clenched his jaw and endured until sweat dripped off his chin and pooled on the floor. The rehabilitation center became both battlefield and sanctuary. The walls echoed with grunts, encouragement, and the sharp clicks of walkers on tile floors. Other patients noticed his determination, whispering that the kid who had once been given no chance of survival was now dragging himself toward an impossible dream. The therapists, hardened by years of seeing patients surrender, found themselves moved by his refusal to quit. His parents remained by his side, balancing work and exhaustion, cheering every twitch, every shuffle, every awkward attempt to stand upright. They were there for the tears, the small victories, the whispered prayers before sleep. Brian's world was measured in inches gained. The day he took his first faltering step, clutching the bars with white knuckles, the room erupted in applause. He barely made it a foot forward, but it was enough to send tears streaming down his cheeks. That night, he lay in bed replaying the moment again and again, imagining how it might feel to one day walk without assistance, maybe even run. The thought seemed absurd to others, but to Brian, it was oxygen. Months passed, and with them came steady progress. Wheelchairs gave way to crutches, crutches to tentative steps, and each milestone fueled him further. Yet the journey was not linear. There were setbacks, excruciating infections, muscles that refused to cooperate, nights when pain clawed through him so viciously that sleep was impossible. More than once, he stared at the ceiling in the darkness and wondered if the doctors were right, if survival was miracle enough. But then he would remember the sensation of diving into a pool, the adrenaline of a starting line, the freedom of his body in motion. That memory became his anchor. He could not let it go. Eventually, he made it home, though his house now felt like an obstacle course. Stairs loomed like mountains. Chairs and counters sat at impossible heights. The life he had once lived so effortlessly now demanded calculations, adaptations, endless patience. But Brian attacked each challenge with the same stubbornness that had carried him through rehab. He celebrated standing long enough to brush his teeth, walking to the mailbox, shuffling down the block. Neighbors watched in awe as the boy who had nearly died pushed himself past every expectation. College beckoned next, though many thought he was rushing into it. But Brian insisted. He craved normalcy, craved the routine of lectures, friendships, late-night studying. On campus, he moved slowly, but his presence radiated resilience. Classmates who complained about exams or minor inconveniences would glance at him and remember that perspective mattered. He was quiet about his pain, but it was always there, stitched into his every movement. Still, he chose to live loudly in other ways, smiling, engaging, daring himself to keep chasing what once seemed lost. Somewhere along the way, the idea took root. What if he didn't just walk again, or live a normal life? What if he went further? What if he reclaimed not only his body but also the identity of an athlete, a competitor? It began as a whisper, almost laughable. Brian Boyle, the kid who had been dead on the operating table, daring to imagine races, competitions, the roar of crowds. Friends raised eyebrows, therapists cautioned him to temper expectations, but his heart clung to the vision. He could almost hear the splash of water, feel the rhythm of a bike, the pounding of his feet on pavement. The Ironman triathlon, swimming, cycling, running, was the most grueling event he knew. And the idea of it lit a fire deep inside him. Before he could chase that audacious dream, he had to rebuild his foundation. Training started slowly, sometimes painfully so. Jogging a few steps left him gasping, swimming a single lap drained him, cycling a short distance felt like torture. But he treated every session as if it were sacred, every small gain a step closer to the impossible. His parents, watching from the sidelines, sometimes worried he was pushing too far, too fast, but they had long since learned that their son's will was stronger than their fears. By now, Brian had begun to attract attention. Local papers ran stories about the boy who came back from death, who walked again despite predictions, who was training for something bigger. Strangers sent letters, students stopped him to say he inspired them, nurses who had once cared for him visited to witness the transformation. The story of Brian Boyle was spreading, but for him, it was never about fame. It was about reclaiming himself, proving to his own heart that the crash hadn't stolen his life's purpose. Every morning he laced his shoes with ritualistic determination, every swim stroke became a defiance of fate, every bike ride a reminder that his body, broken though it had been, was still his. He knew the Ironman remained far on the horizon, but with every passing day, that horizon drew nearer. He could see it now, not as an impossible dream but as a future waiting to be claimed. The boy who had once been trapped in a hospital bed, silent and motionless, was now standing on the edge of something extraordinary. He was alive, he was moving, and he was preparing for the fight of his life. The morning of the Ironman dawned with a sky that seemed too calm for the storm raging inside Brian Boyle's chest. Years had passed since the night that had torn his life apart, years of surgeries, setbacks, pain, and relentless determination. Now, standing barefoot on the sand among seasoned triathletes, he felt a surreal mix of fear and awe. He was alive. Not just alive, he was about to attempt one of the hardest races on Earth, a 2.4-mile swim, a 112-mile bike ride, and a full marathon, 26.2 miles, all in a single day. The boy who had been pronounced clinically dead was now staring at the ocean, ready to dive into the impossible. The starting horn pierced the morning air. A surge of bodies rushed forward, churning the water into froth. Brian dove in. For a moment, panic clawed at him, the cold water, the crush of athletes, the enormity of what lay ahead. But he forced himself to find rhythm. One arm, then the other, breath, kick, push. Lap after lap of practice came back to him, the muscle memory built over grueling months. He thought about the hospital bed, about the first sip of water he'd taken unassisted, about the day he stood for the first time. Compared to those moments, this water felt like liberation. He swam not just to finish but to honor every step of the journey that had brought him here. He emerged from the sea to the cheers of strangers, dripping and gasping, and rushed to the transition. The bike waited, sleek and daunting. He strapped on his helmet and pushed forward. The miles stretched endlessly, sun beating down, the road stretching like a ribbon into the horizon. His legs burned, his back ached, his lungs protested, but he kept pedaling. Each hill felt like the mountains he'd climbed in rehab, each gust of wind like the resistance of therapists' hands holding him back only to push him further. At mile 70, pain screamed through his body, reminding him of shattered bones and metal plates. He clenched his teeth, whispered to himself, and kept going. He thought of his parents, who had sat through nights of despair, refusing to let hope die. He thought of the doctors who had said survival itself was the miracle. He was here to prove that survival was just the beginning. As the marathon loomed, his body begged him to quit. The transition from bike to running felt like fire tearing through his legs. The first steps were wobbly, like those early days on parallel bars when the world swayed and gravity threatened to drag him down. But he remembered the applause of therapists, the tears of his mother when he first walked. He remembered the vow he had made in the quiet of hospital nights that he would not let the crash define him. So he pushed forward. One step. Then another. Then another. The marathon was agony. Every mile was a battle against fatigue, pain, and the whispers in his head telling him it was too much. The crowd roared, but in his mind, he was alone on that dark road, facing the shadows of his past. He saw flashes, the crash, the coma, the tubes, the surgeries. And then, layered over those images, he saw something else, himself as a boy, running carefree down the streets of his hometown, chasing dreams that now seemed impossibly close. He wasn't running just for himself. He was running for the 18-year-old who had once lain broken, for his parents, for everyone who had ever been told their dreams were impossible. Hours passed, the finish line drawing closer with each labored step. His body screamed to stop, but his spirit refused. And then, finally, the lights of the finish line appeared in the distance. The crowd's cheers swelled, guiding him forward. Tears blurred his vision. His legs, heavy as stone, carried him those last yards. And then he crossed. Arms raised, chest heaving, face streaked with tears and sweat. Brian Boyle, the boy who had been declared dead, had completed the Ironman triathlon. The crowd erupted. Strangers wept. Announcers choked on their words, unable to capture the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Brian collapsed into the arms of volunteers, the weight of triumph crashing over him. In that moment, he wasn't a survivor. He was an athlete. He was a champion. He was proof that the human spirit, when fueled by hope and determination, could overcome the unthinkable. In the months that followed, his story spread far beyond the finish line. Newspapers and television stations called him the Miracle Man. He wrote about his journey, speaking not just about the race but about the nights of despair, the endless grind of rehab, the power of support from family and strangers alike. His story became more than personal triumph, it became a beacon for anyone facing impossible odds. He visited hospitals, speaking to patients who lay in beds as he once had, telling them not to surrender. He stood on stages, reminding crowds that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the refusal to give up in its presence. Brian Boyle never forgot the boy who once stared at the ceiling in a hospital room, wondering if life would ever be worth living again. That boy had become the man who proved that life was not just worth living but worth living fully, defiantly, beautifully. The Ironman was not the end of his story, it was the beginning of a legacy. His message was simple, powerful, unforgettable. No matter how broken, no matter how impossible it seems, you can rise. You can fight. You can finish your race. And somewhere, in the quiet after the applause faded, Brian Boyle allowed himself a smile. He had crawled from death to life, from despair to triumph. And he knew, deep in his soul, that the finish line was never really the end. It was just another starting point.